All right, let's move on to your relatively recent paper on active share in fixed income, which is a really interesting concept. Can you talk about how the arguments in favor of indexing in equities hold up when we move over to fixed income?
It's a completely different world we
Hmm.
found. Yeah, we're excited. It's a new paper, taking a bunch of years to write, but I'm excited about it. Um, it starts with the observation is that passive funds, the actual passive funds in fixed income, are actually not very passive. They don't actually follow the benchmarks very closely, right? The actual passive funds in fixed income or index funds, ETFs in fixed income, um, they have relatively high active shares and they trade a lot. And the reason for this is that other than in equities, where very close replication of the actual benchmarks is fairly easy and low cost, it's not at all the case for fixed income. It's benchmark replication is far from straightforward. Lots and lots of securities in fixed income that are in the benchmarks are very illiquid. So it is practically impossible for a passive fund manager to closely follow the benchmark. And second, the second broad point is fixed income markets are still much, much less efficient than equity markets. And the mutual fund industry, so to speak, is much less competitive, relatively speaking, right? If you compare US fixed income to US equities, especially large cap equities, where most of the money is.
And what are the main challenges for index investing in fixed income?
Yeah, first, the benchmarks in fixed income have too many securities. And so many of these securities are fairly illiquid. For example, the main market-wide benchmark in fixed income in the US is the Bloomberg US Aggregate. It contains more than 12,000 different securities. And I think about half of those don't trade on any given day. So in general, many of these securities are not very liquid at all. And that means if you are a manager of a passive fixed income fund, you face a real trade-off that is not really faced by your equity counterparts. So a passive fixed income fund faces a trade-off between, on the one hand, tracking the benchmark, but on the other hand, you want to also control or really limit their trading cost and provide liquidity to their investors. And it's really hard to do both. It's really hard to closely track, but do so at a low cost that provides liquidity to your investors.
We had Hank Bessenbinder on this podcast a while ago, pretty recently actually, and he talked about the performance of equity mutual funds at long horizons and how it kind of gets worse and worse the longer you go out. How do active bond funds perform relative to index funds at increasing horizons?
Yeah, Bessemer makes a very, very, very powerful argument for equity funds. I find his work very compelling. So it's very different for bonds. The average active bond fund has outperformed their passive counterparts, not by much, and statistically significant, is marginal. In our sample, we look at a fairly large, long sample, is about 28 basis points per year, with some but not strong statistical confidence.
And what explains that?
Well, first, as I elaborated, passive investing in fixed income is very difficult. Trading is very costly. On the other hand, fixed income markets are much less efficient, and the industry there is less competitive than for US equities.
You talked about how bond index funds don't really look like the index. How does the active share of a typical bond index fund look?
Yeah, the active share bond funds is one of the things, of course, we do in our paper. We adjust it for the fixed income market. So we compute active shares at two different levels. The security level, which is the bond issue level, which is we can directly compare to the active share of an equity fund. Right? Very few equities have more than one share class. But you can also compute the active share of a bond fund at the firm level or the issuer level. For example, IBM Corporation issues many, many different bonds. So you can look at the IBM bonds at the issue level, or you can aggregate up across all the different issues that an issuer like IBM has issued, and then calculate the portfolio weights at the level of the issuer, the firm, right? And then you first aggregate up the weights, and then you end up with two different active shares. So the median passive bond fund has a bond level active share, so security level active share of 55%, which is incredibly high, right? And you can compare that to the median active share of a passive equity fund, which is about 2%. In other words, passive equity funds are actually really, really low active share, 2%, the median, while for passive bond funds, those are substantially different than the benchmarks.
And how does bond liquidity affect bond index fund active share?
Yeah, if you look at where the active share of these passive index funds come from, then it comes primarily from them avoiding the more illiquid issues in their benchmark. And those are costly to trade. The need to provide liquidity to our investors. There's a lot of turnover, and so they minimize costs by avoiding trading in some of the less liquid parts of the benchmark, which also, of course, they have to, then that means they also have a more tracking error that comes with that. But doing that increases their active share and can explain why the median active share of the passive fixed income funds in our sample, including ETFs, is 55%.
So you talked about a couple of the reasons that it's different in fixed income than it is in equities. What about the skewness argument? Like that's one of the things that we talked to Hank Bessenbender about. Does that apply in fixed income markets?
It doesn't. So just to maybe recap, I find Henrik Bessenbender's skewness argument very compelling. I think it's a very strong argument pertaining to equity funds. Right? In equity funds, the distribution cross-sectionally of equity returns is very strongly positively skewed. Right? That a few names, few stocks have extremely high positive stock returns, and those few names drive, right, the performance of the market, drive outperformance. That's where the idea of buying the haystack comes from. Right? That outperformance requires you to be in those names. And one way to do that is be very well diversified, right, and buy the haystack. So that argument of very strong positive skewness strengthens, right, the diversification benefit of indexing of passive management. Right? We find that argument simply doesn't apply to bonds. Bond returns are not very positively skewed. They have hardly any skew at all, especially compared to stocks. So the positive skewness argument is simply moot. We repeat several of the exercises that Professor Bessenbender has done, and we don't find that it applies to bond markets. And for example, one of the things that he does in his papers is he chooses like random stocks and see what is the percentage that a random stock will underperform, right? Or you form portfolios that are not super well diversified. You know, how many stocks does it take before this skewness effect wears out? So for equities, it requires, they're doing this from memory, but I think hundreds of stocks before this skewness effect wears out. And for bonds, it doesn't. If you have 30 bonds, then the skewness effect is moot because the skewness in bonds is much less positive. And so the diversification argument, the skewness argument doesn't really apply to bonds.
Yeah, it makes sense, I guess, because you wouldn't have big upside in a single bond issue for some reason. They're all going to be pretty...
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I've long thought fixed income. I thought it, I think, for 10 years at Yale, and I thought it at Notre Dame when I started here. And I always like to tell my students, bonds are very strange instruments. The best you can ever hope to get from a bond is exactly what it promises to pay you.
Exactly.
Of course, I'm not looking at any embedded options or convertibles, right? If you just look at a straight bond, then the best you can ever do is that the bond gives you exactly the cash that it promises. So in other words, the upside is strictly limited.
Right.
Of course, if interest rates go way down, then, you know, then you may have a decent upside. But there's a strict limit to the upside, and you still have the whole downside.
Right.
And so that explains exactly why bond returns are much less positively skewed than equities, because equities don't really have an upside limit.
Yeah. Right. So I kind of implicitly answered this in answering the previous questions. Why do you think active bond funds have remained relatively popular despite active management declining in popularity within equities?
Yeah, that was the starting point of our paper, where we just observed that, empirically speaking, these massive outflows that we've observed in the active management industry for equities hasn't happened in bonds. And so passive investing in bond funds has also become more popular, but we've not seen the massive outflows out of actively managed bond funds. I think a lot of that is just about performance. Active bond funds have performed fine. They have generally outperformed passive bond funds. Passive bond funds, as I explained, are actually not that passive. Then in our paper, we have a lot of results related to ActiveShare. We find that the high ActiveShare bond funds have done substantial outperformance. We found significant positive performance persistence among high ActiveShare bond funds. And we also find that the high ActiveShare bond funds have significant protection on the downside. So if you look at the maximum drawdown over, let's say, quarters, then the high ActiveShare bond funds perform pretty well there. In other
really
words, the case for active management and bond funds seems relatively strong.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anecdotally, Cameron and I have talked to sort of peer firms like us, and it's not uncommon to find a firm that's really passionate about index investing within equities, but they are still using active management in fixed income, which I think speaks to the points you're making here.